I'm live. I finished Joan Marshall Grant's book about Lot and a couple of days ago, and I thought I had read all of her books, but I came across this one. It's entitled Vague Vacations by Joan Grant, and I ordered it. It wasn't actually very expensive, and it was published in 1947. The last one I read about Lot in France was published 1962. So this is published much later, much earlier, like over 20 years earlier, and it is dedicated to my father with love. And I cannot resist reading it aloud. So I shall. This is obviously also a travel book. There's maps here and everything. This is the first edition. I'm delighted with it. And it encompasses Amiens, Beauvais, Paris, Fontainebleau, Montargis, and goes down to Lyon and Grenoble. Now I know nothing about that area of France at all. So this will be an educational journey for me too. Chapter 1. Pat Vert. It was not the sea which woke me at dawn on the 18th of September, but the somber recognition that I had produced yet another attack of allergy. I was covered with nettle rash and my face was hideously swollen. It seemed brutal to wake Charles, but what else could I do? He would have to give me several injections of adrenaline before I could hope to become reasonably presentable, and even these were sometimes ineffective. I think this music is a little too loud. If he sent me back to Wales and took the car alone to France, no one would blame him. What use was a wife who had not even the wit to choose a romantic ailment if she was stupid enough to be ill? But as usual, he was very considerate, and if he shared my fears that we would have been wiser to stay at Trelawny, he concealed them admirably. After the 5th injection, he had to take the Citroën to the docks, leaving me to follow him in an hour. I alternately stared out of the window, where the Folkestone promenade was grey against a background of waves, white to the horizon, and at my face an even more cheerless prospect. If I draped a scarf over my head, perhaps no one would notice that there was something wrong, or would the most nearsighted official penetrate this thin disguise and be convinced that my proper designation was quarantine? I threw the last few oddments into the zipper grip. The 5 suitcases had gone with the car, and discovered that the cork had wriggled out of a bottle of antiseptic. Maps were sodden, the pages of books stuck together, even the cigarettes were damaged. I salvaged some and packed them insecurely in a paper bag. The girl at the reception desk seemed to see nothing unusual, which cheered me a little, as I had expected her to ask if it would be in order to make an extra charge for fumigating our room. The taxi driver remarked gaily that the crossing would be remarkably rough, and that we were lucky to be going before the later sailings were cancelled. When I reached the SS Autocarrier, the only sign of Charles was his trench coat neatly folded on a bollard. No doubt he had decided that suicide was preferable to a holiday in my company, and who could disagree? I asked an AA man whether he had seen anyone called Beatty wearing a green hat, but he produced no useful information, so I plodded back through the rain to the dock gates. We eventually found each other near the passport office, and both pretended we had been walking so fast only because it was cold. "I've borrowed the purser's cabin," he said briskly. "I thought you might need an injection on the boat. Only for cosmetic reasons, of course. You're all right now, aren't you? Being thoroughly sick will probably complete my cure. And it's rough enough to do it without losing face. Not that I shouldn't be delighted to lose the one I'm hiding behind at the moment." We watched the car swung down into the hold, and soon afterwards were allowed on board. The cabin could become a refuge, where sundry humiliations might be suffered in privacy. But the basin was small, and to violate the purser's sea boots would be a breach of all laws of hospitality. As the harbour receded, Charles went to see the salon, and on deck to stare disconsolately at the heaving water. In a despairing effort to postpone what seemed inevitable, I looked round to see whether there was anyone to talk to. On my right was a man cringing into his mackintosh, but his glassy stare suggested he was in no mood for conversation. Towards the stern, a small group huddled on a bench in the doubtful shelter of the superstructure, clutched at rugs which the gusts tried to snatch from them. I peered into the salon and saw Charles breakfasting on the mound of ham, watching with respect by the only other passenger to dare the smell of pickles. So I should have to talk to myself. A dull process, but better than waiting in silence for the immediate future to catch up with me. At least I could take the offensive. "Why be sick?" I demanded. "You have been sick once in the Atlantic, once in the Irish Sea, once in the Channel. This is your 25th, or is it your 27th crossing? Are you sure that being a bad sailor isn't a theory you ought to debunk?" "Who would bother to invent a theory about being seasick?" I replied sourly. "You might, just to play safe, tiresome mock modesty as an excuse to show off." "I don't play safe." I felt really indignant. Perhaps at times I may be a trifle precipitate, but I am never smug. "Oh, aren't you?" This was said with such unnecessary conviction that I realized something must be interfering with the comforting trend I had. "Smug and fussy. Look how long you took to make up your mind." How long it took to make up your mind to leave Trelane. All that telephoning, all those last-minute arrangements, all the suitcases, half of them full of things you will never use. Bah! It was of urgent necessity to form a mental picture of my interrogator. I am familiar with being several people at once, but this facet seemed to be getting out of hand. However, if there was a part of my subconscious which was demanding attention, I could at least invent a shape and a name for it. What was it like? Being recessive, it was undoubtedly masculine, so not it, but he. Being appallingly candid, at the same time sufficiently beguiling to insist on attention, he was undoubtedly Irish. He had better be small enough to be dealt with. 18 inches would be about right for a distant relation of Leprechauns. As yet, I could visualize only his hands, green hands, the texture of vine leaves. "I shall call you Pates Vertes," I said, "because of your hands being green." "You needn't explain," he said. I can speak French better than you, and anyway, I spell it Pat there, in memory of the old country. Why did we meet here? Because you and your husband are the first civil people I've spoken to since I brought this ship safely back from her 5th trip to Dunkirk. I don't like travelling alone, so I stayed here until I found someone congenial. The man in the mackintosh stared at me in horror and lurched unsteadily out of sight. "Silly bastard," said Petrol rudely. "Gone to be sick he has, and serve him right for having no manners, and why shouldn't you talk to me?" "I shall probably be sick soon, so don't be too rough with him," I said, with a return of apprehension. "Nonsense! Stop being futile as an oily gull, and use your wits, like dancing, don't you? Well, dance." I hesitated. The deck, now awash at frequent intervals, seemed an unlikely flaw, and the sight of me attempting a pas seul might finally unnerve the sorry shapes who shared it with me. "Not alone, silly, with a C. Can't you hear it asking you to dance and getting offended when you haven't the decency to reply? Are you going to wait till it gets really impatient and drags you round till you are dizzy?" Dance with a C? It sounded reasonable. I leaned my shoulders against the side of the superstructure, braced my feet apart, and let my body relax, obedient to the guidance of a new partner. It was easier than doing a rumba, and required no more skill than close attention to the rhythm of the waves. Patver nodded approval. "I must admit, you learn fast once you get an idea. Remember, your sea legs are really your sea bottom, and you won't go wrong." He was entirely correct. My centre of gravity was certainly at the base of the spine. I had never felt less sick. I was enjoying myself. I joined Charles, who was talking to the other passenger, a charming Frenchman with excellent English. When I had convinced him that I had seldom felt better, he went on deck to the gale, and I took over his conversation. Among double brandies, we discovered a mutual interest in limited editions and modern book bindings. Suddenly the steward heaved and fled. Soon afterwards, a distant crash from the crew's gallery suggested that their lunch had jumped the stove. "It really is rough," I said complacently. "This is the end of my delusion that I'm a bad sailor." "You are very, very fortunate," he replied with deliberation I was too dull to recognize. "It is probable that the secret of England's invulnerability is that no other race could remain battle-worthy after they have reached her shores by sea. I wonder if the salt cellars are going to jump the fiddles. I trust not. Surely the beat would have to stand on her head before that were possible." "Nothing is really impossible," I said absent-mindedly. Pat Vert must have been listening. A flock of salt cellars followed in majestic procession by the mustard pots, surged over their fences, and crashed to the floor. "I will return," said my Frenchman, courteous to the last. I had another double brandy with a barman, and felt even better. So that was the first chapter of Vague Vacations. Today is the 3rd of December.